Hi, I'm Mr. Otway, Head of History at Ossett Academy, otherwise known as Otters in some corners of the internet, and this is the first of our revision podcasts on the American West, focusing on the Mormons, in particular how and why they were persecuted from 1823 to 1846, before exploring the reasons for the success of their move to the Great Salt Lake in 1846. Mormonism began through the leadership of Joseph Smith in New York State in 1823, and by 1830 he had built up quite a following through his charismatic public speeches. Unfortunately, right from the start, the Mormons were disliked and persecuted, which basically is a fancy way of saying that people picked on them in extreme ways. The Mormons moved from New York State to Ohio, 1831 to 37. They lived in then Missouri from 1837 to 38, and then Illinois, 1838 to 46, and no matter where they settled, they were persecuted. Some significant events occurred during this period of movement for the Mormons. For example, in Ohio, the Mormons became prosperous, which means quite wealthy, and set up a bank. But the bank failed, and those people in Ohio who lost their savings were furious, causing more persecution. In Missouri, the Mormons set up their own secret police force in an attempt to protect themselves. They were called the Danites. In Missouri, the people were suspicious of the Mormons because they wanted to free slaves and were friendly with the Plains Indians. They attacked the Mormons, burnt down their houses, and threw their leader Joseph Smith into jail. In Illinois, the Mormons rebuilt a decaying town called Commerce and renamed it, I don't know how to pronounce this, but we'll go for it, Nauvoo. It became a prosperous, wealthy town. It seems that anywhere the Mormons went, they were successful, perhaps, as we are later to see, because of their unquestionable faith in their leaders and through their organisation, but also, wherever the Mormons went and were successful, people resented them. They were jealous of the Mormons, and the Mormons were often subsequently, or always subsequently, attacked. In Illinois, the Mormons were also attacked, and this time Joseph Smith was thrown in jail before a mob broke into the jail and killed Joseph Smith. So in 1844, the Mormons had lost their charismatic leader, the founder of Mormonism. It must have been a terrible blow. But luckily, Brigham Young was the next leader, and he proved to be an exceptionally gifted leader. Young decided that if the Mormons were to live in peace, then they had to leave the east coast of America and forge a life for themselves somewhere out on the Great Plains. He began to organise the Great Journey for 1,500 men, women and children. Itself no easy feat, particularly when we consider that this journey was going to head in roughly the same direction as the Donner Party, which in the same year, 1846, had ended in complete disaster. The Donner Party had only 300 migrants, whereas Young was going to attempt to move 1,500 people, so it's clear to see that this was not an easy task. The Mormon journey was successful, and they travelled the huge distance of 2,250 kilometres without disaster, before Brigham Young decided that they should stop at the Great Salt Lake and begin the new Mormon settlement there. Perhaps the success of the journey can be attributed to four things. Firstly, Young insisted on strict discipline. Secondly, he organised the migrants into manageable groups, each with their own leader. And the Mormons accepted the groupings without question. And thirdly, he taught them how to organise their wagons into a protective circle at night. Finally, he insisted that the Mormons stopped regularly to rest. And thus, they made a successful journey and stopped in the Great Salt Lake. The Great Plains were not easy to farm, as you might know from studying the homesteaders, and the area around the Great Salt Lake in particular was not very arable, which means good for farming. It was going to take something special for the settlement to take off, and luckily for the Mormons, they were more than capable of making a success of the new settlement. There were a number of main reasons for this. Firstly, Brigham Young had total control over the settlement, and his followers would do as he said without question. This included one of his first decisions, which was that nobody owned the land, the Mormon Church owned all of it. And thus, in one decision, Young helped to prevent the land squabbles and problems that existed in all of the other new settlements in the American West. Another consequence of the Mormons obeying the every word of Brigham Young was that although there was not much fresh water to go around, Young managed it so that people were only allowed to get water at certain times. Thus the water supply was never exhausted because they all did exactly as he said. He also ordered people to dig irrigation ditches, bringing the fresh water from surrounding streams and rivers to the new land that the Mormons would attempt to farm. Couldn't, of course, use the water in the Great Salt Lake because it's called the Great Salt Lake for a reason. You can't farm using salty water. So, the unwavering dedication and obedience of the Mormons to the word of Brigham Young was one key reason why they were so successful. A second reason has to be Young's leadership itself. It's one thing to obey a leader unquestionably, but if he made poor decisions, then the Mormons would have been doomed. Apart from the decisions already discussed, Young also ensured that all territory around the Great Salt Lake was surveyed to find potentially arable land, and he chose people with different skills that could help one another to make a new small settlement work. So, for example, if they found somewhere through their surveying that might be a good place to farm, he might send somebody with farming expertise, somebody with some medical knowledge, somebody who was an effective builder, and so on and so forth. And because the Mormons obeyed him, they just went. A new settlement sprung up successfully around the Great Salt Lake. A third reason has to be the encouragement of emigration. If a new settlement is to be successful, then it needs people. Thousands and thousands of them. To work the land, to work in the cities, and to make settlements around the Great Salt Lake prosperous. The Mormons set up the Perpetual Emigration Fund to provide money for poor Mormons around the world or elsewhere in America to move to the Great Salt Lake. Once they arrived, they had to work to repay the money. This encouraged thousands of settlers. For example, in 1851, in just one country, that was England, over 32,000 people undertook the huge journey halfway across the world to settle in the Great Salt Lake. Now, you consider that's just England, just one place, and it's at a time where they can't just hop on a plane and be over in the Great Salt Lake in a matter of 12, 14 hours. It would take a very long time to make that journey, which would have been dangerous as well. And they were leaving everything behind to get over there. And that would never have happened if the Mormons hadn't set up the Perpetual Immigration Fund. And you've also got to bear in mind that was just in England. This must have been happening in other places as well. The story does not stop there. Bizarrely, the territory that the Mormons had chosen to settle in was owned by Mexico, originally, not the USA, in 1846. However, no Mexicans lived anywhere near the Great Salt Lake, which is in the north of the USA, whereas, as you might know, Mexico's down at the south, on the borders of the south of the USA. And in 1848, after the US had won a war with Mexico and managed to gain all of the land, which included the Great Salt Lake, Brigham Young began to argue for the area of Mormon settlement around the Great Salt Lake to become a US state. This would give the Mormons freedom to create their own laws and control their own affairs. After a long struggle, which you can read about in the textbooks or in your revision books or in your exercise books hopefully, and after agreeing to ban polygamy, which was something the Mormons practiced, which was where they were allowed to have more than one wife, Utah finally became a state in 1890. And thus the Mormons had gone from, in less than 100 years from there not being any such thing as Mormonism, through a period of terrible persecution, to forging a life for themselves, a territory for themselves, and a very successful one at that, in the state of Utah. I've been Otters, and that was another Osset History podcast. Don't forget, you need to make use of the textbooks, of your exercise books, of any revision books, if you're going to reach your full potential in the exam, but I hope that was useful. Use it to make notes, listen to it often before the exam.